Hi, Hi everyone. Welcome to Allegory Story. My name is Tegan Aline,
My name is Melanie Nevis.
and welcome to I think are we in season 5 now? Yeah, season 5. Yeah,
Yeah.
season 5, where we are exploring the stories of Celtic mythology. And I think we talked about this in the last episode, but Celtic, the idea of Celtic is really a broad spectrum. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like okay, sidebar, my cat is on me making biscuits, and I feel like you can hear it. If you can hear it in the background, sorry about that. But if you're wondering what that scratching sound is, she's getting comfortable and it will stop.
I
Anyways,
honestly can't hear anything,
it's weird
but
because
she's
I
been
can
making
hear it.
biscuits for a bit yet. Yeah, well,
It's
you're
like
right
the
there.
mic's right there, so I don't know, but we're not going
I
to
can't
discuss.
hear her, but
That's good. I'm glad. Maybe nobody will hear it. Anyways, so
Izzy's cute.
yeah. So Celtic mythology is really broad, and we dove into kind of like a general overview in one of the last episodes. And today we're going to look into something that I think is like quite intriguing for anybody who develops an interest in Celtic mythology, which is the concept of the Druid, right? The
Mm-hmm.
Druid is just saying the name, it kind of makes you think of a certain type of figure, like a wise old sage man.
In tune with nature and
Yeah.
kind of almost magical, but
Yeah.
more learned, if that makes
And
sense.
and one of the things that kind of is interesting about them is that they're not specific necessarily to one part of Celtic mythology. They're not like just Irish or just Welsh or whatever. They are seen in different variations throughout Celtic mythology, or like or cultures. But I would say that probably like the Irish tradition in general is just like the best kept mythology that we have. So
Definitely.
you do see a lot more information on them in the mythological cycles, which I think we also talked about in the last episode, right? In the Irish
Yeah, we did.
mythology.
Or like the last, I don't know which one, but we have talked about it.
So what's interesting is that Druids were, there were members of an ancient priest like caste. So obviously they were not priests, but that is the idea, is that they were kind of like wise, exonerated people. Um,
Mm-hmm.
they were primarily found in parts of Ireland, Britain, and Gaul, which we learned in the last episode is modern day France. And they played a significant role in the cultures, in the Celtic cultures, as religious leaders, scholars, and often roles like judges and advisors
Mm-hmm.
to kings. We see that a lot in the stories. And I think I've even seen at some point where people may consider someone like Merlin from the Arthurian legends that we discussed in the last season. A lot of people would maybe classify him as a druid as well, given his position and given the way that he was with the king. And
Well, yeah, I think there are theories that the character of Merlin, as we know him in the Arthurian legends, was based off of a druid named Myrddin,
yeah,
who was
okay.
a real person.
So there you go.
Yeah.
That completely makes sense, especially when you start to like dive into the stories of druids a little bit more. So the word druid, it comes from a Celtic word that's like very similar, druid, I think. And it's spelt the same. There's just an H at the end. And it means the oak knowledge, or the knowledge of the oak tree. And I think that's an important thing to kind of note, because Druids, the oak tree was very significant to them. Not only
Mm-hmm.
that, but I was reading in some other work from like a while ago that if you find a grove of oak trees, and when the oak trees have mistletoe in them, that is like the most holy and like profound connection in nature for the Druids. So
Yeah,
it
because
would make sense.
mistletoe was really one of the most important plants, and we can kind of go into that a little bit later. But mistletoe is one of the most important plants for druids.
Yes. Yes, and in terms of trees, it was the oak. So I think it was
The oak, yeah, exactly.
a
It's like this
combination.
marriage of the two, yeah.
Yeah. So, like you were saying, they Druids are known for their deep connection to nature and the spiritual world. They were known for conducting rituals and ceremonies in sacred groves, like what we were just talking about. And they held a profound respect to the land and animals and the cycles of the seasons. And additionally, Druids were responsible for preserving and passing down traditions, including myths, legends, and historical accounts. They had a multifaceted role, and they encompassed all of these things, whether it be religion, philosophy, medicine, or law. And they served as intermediaries. I feel like almost like, in a sense of a word, they're kind of like the voice of reason in a lot of ways, in a lot of
Yeah.
situations. And I think it's really interesting. There's some two interesting things to note about Druids. So they didn't transcribe, they didn't write their history. So if you had to wanted to study in ancient times to be a druid, you would have had to, study with them and learn everything to memorization.
Yeah, almost like it would be you become their apprentice, and it would be something that happened for like 20 years or something like that, where you would have to learn all these things because you really did have to just commit everything to memory, every knowledge of every plant, of your histories, of your lore, myths, of like which clan leaders were where, because they were really political as well. Like
Yes.
just committing
And
all of
that's
that.
another thing, we don't talk about that so much when we think about druids today, but it's really apparent when you like dig into them a bit, is that they were quite politically involved in various different forms. Not like they were honest, they chose sides. And I think a lot of the time it's
Hmm.
quite interesting because in today's spiritual landscape, a lot of people try to like take this more like Buddhist detachment form of like, I'm not a part of this, I don't exist in this or whatever. And I
Hmm.
think it's really interesting when we look at people like the Druids, because that was definitely not the case. And they were sitting as advisory council as well, and law council for that matter. So they were very much involved in the political dealings of their time, and still manage to hold a reverence for nature and hold a
Hmm.
balance. And in that way, druids feel very similar. Like there's a similarity between druidry and almost like indigenous shamanism when you do a bit of
Yeah, I can see
research into
that.
that.
I can see that.
This duality for nature, I don't know if duality is the right word, but like, this reverence for nature, but also understanding that a society exists in nature and exists with its own system as well. Like those are common practices in a lot of the old indigenous legends and stories, or I should say just stories, not legends as well. So I think that
Hmm.
that's really an interesting point to say about druids.
Also, one interesting thing that shows their political prowess, I guess, is they would actually correspond with the magi of like ancient Persia and the Chaldeans of Assyria. So their reach was really
That's
far wide,
crazy.
if that is any
So cool.
indication of how revered in society and how trusted they were to make decisions and to basically get a bunch of information of what was happening in the surrounding world.
Yeah, absolutely. But like we said, because they taught their tradition orally, and I actually do understand this to a degree. It's similar when I was studying Indian tabla and Kathak. Of course, they let us write things down, but traditionally, you would actually learn based on repetition, like repeating
Hmm.
a certain composition over and over again. It would like get into your body, and that's kind of like, they let us write things down, but the best way we were always taught to learn is by doing it over and over. So in that way, I kind of understand it. But unfortunately, because of invading nations and the way humankind kind of works, when when the Greeks and the Romans kind of came in, or not the Greeks, but the Romans kind of came in and took over, really, because this started to happen, we don't have written record of from directly from the Druids. So most of what we know
Mhm.
about Druids today are what we know from reading old accounts that were written by people who did write their things down, like the Romans. And in that case, there's a certain level of bias that is to be considered in the material, especially once,
100%.
yeah, especially once Christianity comes into play. Because we if you guys have listened to our podcast, you know what Christianity was doing. So we know that they are always trying to find ways to villainize things that are not really Christian. So there's a lot of maybe stories that might seem a bit more aggressive or whatever, but all this to say is that we don't know, really, we don't have any factual information from the culture itself, because
Mhm.
it wasn't their tradition to write it down. And it's an important thing to know when you're kind of looking through the stories or whatever, is that it's not originally sourced from the culture itself.
But it was actually like the material that we have from the Romans predates Christianity, some of it.
Oh yeah, for
So
sure.
it's like really still an invading colonial power going in and making the culture that they're colonizing out to be brutish and barbaric
Of
and
course,
animalistic.
it's like a justification, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a justification for
Sorry, I
really
didn't mean to
disgusting
imply that
acts.
the Romans
Yeah, no,
were
no,
like
no. No.
writing nice stuff about them. It's like,
No, I just mean like it wasn't just like what we have of the Druids or information that we have. It wasn't just impacted by Christianity. It actually
mm-mm,
predates Christianity, and it was already
absolutely.
impacted by a colonial power that decided to invade and try and subjugate.
And on the other hand, it is kind of interesting because a lot of what we have, like in terms of mythology, it was written by Christian monks. So, yeah, it's written in their interpretation. So, not all of the things are necessarily positive, but it's interesting because I think at some point, like I get the impression that at some point there was probably some people that became Christian and they were like, I want to keep these stories alive, but I can't tell it the way I know it because I'll get in trouble. So I'm going to Christianize it. And we see that that's actually probably one of the main reasons why Irish mythology is so well kept, because like the monks came in and did that. And same with the Welsh
Hmm.
mythologies too. So it's this, I guess it's kind of one of those things, like you can be a beneficiary and a victim of your time all at once.
Yeah, I know what you mean by that. I know what you
Yeah,
mean by that.
so like it's interesting because on one hand the stories are changed, but on the other hand they manage to keep them alive at all, and I guess that does mean
Hmm.
something because at least we have something to go off of today. you know
Yeah,
Otherwise we
yeah.
definitely wouldn't know. And I think also it's notable to make a distinction between the Druids we're talking about, like the Druids of mythology, versus the Druids we have today in today's culture, which again is considered similar to like neo-paganism. It's considered neo-druidry. So it's a resurgence of druidry, and there are lots of druid sects out in the world. But it's
Hmm.
not to say that they're necessarily doing or doing the same practices as the old druids. We don't know, because we don't know necessarily what those practices were, because that's one thing that we like did not have track of, right? So we have
Right.
stories about druids, but we don't know what their ceremonies were, and things like that. But I imagine
Hmm.
if you're working with nature, a lot of this is an intuitive response to nature. So I still believe in cellular memory to a degree. So like I believe that
Yeah.
probably modern druids could tap into something that old druids did, but we have no justification or proof for it. But you know, you have to decide for yourself how important that is in the case of like a spiritual practice like that. I guess.
Yeah, and I think sometimes just because things they look like they disappear doesn't mean like it entirely disappears. It could have been an underground thing for a really long time, and there might be remnants that would definitely
Always,
have
always.
changed. They would definitely have changed because nothing can remain exactly the same for 2,000 years. But
Yeah.
there might be some remnant truth that what happened 2,000 years ago is still being practiced in the Druidry of today. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know.
And
But there's a possibility
I
there.
think we saw kind of a very similar, I totally agree with you. I think we saw a very similar case of that when we were diving into Diana a
Hmm.
few seasons ago. And just the fact that like there was a major repression that existed for a really long period of time, but
Hmm.
it's still maintained within folk and like within tradition amongst people. And then there was a resurgence, there was a complete rework and redevelopment in the early 1800s, which, we can say what we want for modernization, but it is interesting that a lot of these resurgences came at the end of the 1800s into the 1900s. And, like there became an opening where people could start exploring these things publicly and more openly, and it became a bit safer to do that and question that without being like scared of being burned at the stake or whatever.
Yeah.
So I mean, for sure things definitely get carried, and they probably, like you said, they probably get carried through the underground, they get carried kind of quietly. Really, it's again, we have Christianity to thank for all of the mystery around it, because the information wasn't you couldn't openly pass it around, right?
No. No, definitely not.
It's funny how that kind of stuff works. So you were saying when
Yeah.
you did some research on this, you were learning about the Wicker Man. So I didn't
Yeah.
actually go down that path, and I'd be really curious to hear what
Yeah.
you had kind of what you had discovered, because I don't have connections. I don't understand any of it. So explain it to me like I know nothing, because I do.
Okay, so there's a couple of parts to this. So, yeah, we know that a lot of what we know about Druids was written by the Romans. So, one of the Romans to write it is written by Julius Caesar. Then there was also another historian who wrote in the 8th century, actually. So, 8th century BCE, apparently. So,
Okay. Oh.
actually a lot earlier. But he basically, yeah, his name was Diodorus, and he said that they had soothsayers of great renown who told the future by watching the flights of birds and observing the entrails of
Oh
victims.
my gosh.
And Roman writers and historians that like we've gained most of our knowledge from them. We know that they're polytheistic. They had female gods, they had sacred figures,
Hmm.
a lot like Greeks and Romans. However, they were nomadic. They were less civilized, according to
Hmm.
Romans, right?
Hmm.
And it gave these Romans, these colonizing powers, a sense of superiority.
Hmm.
And so, like, again, like, take everything with a grain of salt because these may be very exaggerated examples of Druidic practices. There's no Druidic human sacrifice that was necessarily like recorded that we have hard evidence of. But yeah, okay. So historians kind
Sacrifices
of at one point,
probably, I think we can kind of guess that sacrifices probably happened. Probably not human ones though.
yeah, it's just a
But
matter of whether it's animal or human. So
yeah.
at one point, historians kind of came to dismiss the Roman claims that Druids were supporting this really brutal religious tradition. They kind of thought that that was all overblown. And then this controversy around this kind of came up again in 1984. So before
Ha!
this, historians were like, no,
Oh my
not a
guacamole.
real thing. That year in Cheshire, in England, a peat cutter was going through and like cutting the peat, and then he found human remains,
Okay.
which came to be known as the Lindo Man. And he'd basically been preserved in a bog for 2,000 years. And
Hmm.
he'd become a bog body, which is kind of a gross term, but true. Um, he became
Like
this
a
bog
mummy.
body. Yeah. After suffering blows to the head and being stabbed and strangled before being left for dead in the bog.
I see.
And they did this autopsy and they discovered that his stomach contained mistletoe pollen. And so people started to speculate again that maybe he was ritually sacrificed, maybe he was a druidic prince. Like, this conversation kind of came up again. So when we're reevaluating and looking at the text, that's where the Wicker Man comes up. And
Okay.
it's supposedly one of the means by which these ancient Druids would create or make human sacrifice. So Druids didn't really speak of the way these sacrifices were carried out, but this reference to the Wicker Man can be found in two classical sources. So Caesar said that human sacrifices were commonly performed by Druids employed by those who are afflicted by severe diseases or engaged in battles or dangers. However, human sacrifices ordained for national purposes may have also been performed. And he said that sacrifices involving criminals were more acceptable to the immortal gods,
Mm,
but when supply was short, the innocent would also be sacrificed.
interesting.
And
Okay.
yeah, so a wicker man would be a figure of vast size, as Caesar said it, but basically this giant figure with limbs, like a giant standing man,
Mm-hmm.
made of willow, because willow can be bent.
Mm-hmm.
So they create this large man like shape.
Mm-hmm.
And, the arms and legs are kind of cages. And
Mm-hmm.
they fill them with living men. And
Oh, okay.
these figures, or like this wicker man, is then set on fire with the
Mm.
people inside, and they'd be burned alive. It's also mentioned in Strabo's geography, where they devised a colossus of straw and wood for the purpose of sacrifice. But Strabo also says that cattle and wild animals and all sorts of beings were thrown into the colossus and then burnt.
Hmm.
And he said that it was just one method of human sacrifice. He gave another two, which were they would shoot victims to death with arrows or impale them in the temples.
Well, I mean, it really sounds like the pot calling the kettle black in a lot of
I
ways
know.
when you
I
know
know.
what
I
you
know.
know about the Romans. But anyway, it's not like they weren't
I
burning
know.
people alive either.
Yeah.
But it's always that human sacrifice part where it kind of, gets I think it
Well,
gets
and I
people
think now,
nervous.
I agree with you. I think, though, that a lot of people now, I mean, if you look at even a wicker chair and let's just say you set it on fire, that structural integrity is lost really, really quickly when something like that is on fire. So,
Mhm.
a live animal or a person in the Wicker Man theoretically would be able to struggle and break out once it was set on fire. And like if you think about it, you light it, doesn't matter where you light it from, unless you have some sort of ladder, high apparatus to reach it at the top, you're probably going to light it from the bottom and
Mhm.
it's going to go up and that whole thing is going to collapse.
Mhm.
You're not going to have this forever standing tall thing. So it's possible that if it was a method of killing, that any animals or people that were put inside may have been drugged first, because I think
Mm.
that's the only way that people would actually end up staying in there if they were set on fire. Like the fire would
Mm.
kind of burn
Yeah.
the willow pretty
Yeah, there's
fast.
something about it that doesn't totally track. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, what I think that these are reports of anti Celtic propaganda that were used to transmit information that added to this image of Celtic people being savages in the eyes of the Greco Romans.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'd also my intuitive feeling in terms of like there might have been like a spiritual reason to create an effigy of a man-like figure, but
Yeah,
immediately when you were saying they're throwing all kinds of people and animals in there, for me it felt like what if the people what if none of them were alive, and like what if they were doing this as a way of containment for like diseases or illnesses that were coming around, you know what I mean? Like
maybe.
that seems like something like, that's happened in the past where mass disease has like wiped through a nation, and like,
Hmm.
it can kill animals, it can kill people, and then they have to like burn everything to make sure like this is
To
complete
contain it.
speculation, but I feel like something like that would make more sense. And also we can't forget that like the Greeks, Romans, they had their own history of sacrifices and whatnot. So for them to
Of course they
for them
did,
to
but
write
they're gonna paint. other
Yeah.
people as being terrible.
Well, for them to write that though, it makes me think of like they saw something they didn't understand and they put their own narrative to it, which I think is
Always.
seems like what everybody's kind of saying might have been the case. We can't know for sure,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Yeah. The Wicker Man is still used today in neo pagan practices. Obviously, nothing is sacrificed or burned alive. It's more specifically for the celebration of like a fire feast or at harvest. It's literally just a giant man and it's filled with straw, and they have this massive like bonfire almost. It looks
Yeah.
pretty cool. Um,
Is this where
but
Burning Man got the idea from? Like I'm wondering because I
that's
know
what
you
I thought. Fuck that. Can't even come up with a good idea yourself. You just had to take it from somebody else. But honestly,
When
this
did
is
that
also
start
what people
though?
do.
When did that start, Burning Man? That's like old now. It started like in the 80s or
It
so.
started.
In the dude's defense, I think it was a bit more of an obscure idea back then. And actually, in a way, I don't even know if it's necessarily a bad thing because it might have put that whole concept into more people's paths if they like researched it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm pretty sure I read, like, I have never been there, but I'm pretty sure that like Mel and I have a lot of friends that have been. Mel has been
I've been.
more than once. And
Yeah, I've been 3 times.
yeah, and I'm pretty sure that I read somewhere at some point that I feel like this is where he got the idea from, but kind of
Probably. I wouldn't be surprised.
put a different spin on it, which I don't know. I used to feel different. I feel differently about those things now. I don't know if that's such a bad idea because sometimes we need revivals so we can remember who we are, where we came from. You know what I mean? So I don't know if it's
If
necessarily
if that's the case, so it started in 86. It
86.
put a
Oh,
very yeah.
86 was a bizarre year. I've been hearing so many things that happened in 86 lately, and I was like, wow, a whole lot happened that year.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, I can't remember them all right now, but it's been coming up a lot. That's the year I was born. It was an 8 year as well. Like
Oh, okay.
numerology
Well,
wise, I
there you
think it's
go.
an 8 year. And we're in an 8 year this year. And astrologically speaking, they are just like saying this year is going to be off the chizards.
Well, yeah,
Well,
it's
if
already off
January
to a
was
start.
any, yeah, if January and February are any indication, that's accurate so far. So,
Yeah.
8 years, cool.
Yay.
Yay? Question mark,
Yay.
exclamation. But that's really interesting, and I think I remember too because I think one of the first aside from the books, one of the thing that book I was talking about in one of the other episodes, but aside from that and the fairies, another thing that got me really into maybe more like the pagan side of Celtic stuff was actually Lorena McKenna. I don't know. Do you know who that is?
I don't think so.
Oh, she's like a since I was a young kid, I've been into world music, like what they classify in music as world music. And Lorena McKenna is like a Celtic folk singer. And
Oh,
in
cool.
the 90s, the vibe of the 90s, all of those tracks that were like big and came out. But she released a song called The Mummers Dance. And I think in the video for that, there are Wickerman, like small effigies in it. And I think that's the
Probably.
first time I ever saw that in person. And I thought it was, and honestly, to this day, if you put that album on for me, I will be fucking transported. I am absolutely obsessed. I think she's amazing. I still listen to her. But yeah, that was my first interaction with that so many years ago. And I just saw it in a video and I didn't really know what it was. So it's interesting to kind of
Yeah.
learn a bit more about it now. And it also just goes to show people using it in different contexts makes it seem like everybody has a sense that it was probably not like a sacrifice in the way that it was described by Caesar. Well, we all know what
Well, yeah,
happened to Caesar anyway.
I think that we've come to the realization now, like for a really long time, the Roman Empire was built up to be something truly magnificent and wild and crazy. And it was wild and crazy, not necessarily magnificent in all the best senses of the word. But I think it's pretty clear to us now that they weren't all they were cracked up to be, and that their history was definitely written in a way that made them look better.
Oh, for
than
sure.
anyone that they were trying to conquer, and everybody else was barbaric and terrible.
So I'm going to go off course for a second to ask you if you've watched this series about Roman baths on Netflix. It's like an animated series. It's kind of done in like an anime style. And
Oh, I don't
it's
think
so
so.
funny. It's so weird. It's funny. It's worth watching. It's kind of like short clips, and it's basically about a Roman architect that like is building things in the at the peak of Rome, and he has to build like a Roman bath. And he's trying to think about what he could build, how he could make the Roman bath better. And like as he's sitting in a Roman bath, he puts his head underwater and he gets transported to modern day Japan and the onsens in modern day Japan. Oh yeah, it takes a crazy
Oh.
twist. And then so he is freaking out being in modern day Japan looking at the onsens. And so he starts traveling through the baths between times and countries and starts stealing all the ideas from the modern day onsen to put in the Roman baths.
Hilarious.
It's hilarious. And I think probably maybe it was not done that way. Probably wasn't done that way, obviously. But it's super, super funny. But what's double cool is at the end of it, they have real like documentary style short videos of real onsens in Japan and like the water systems and all of that stuff. Because I think the
Yeah.
idea is that a lot of the even modern onsens kind of follow something that's like a bit more Roman in terms of building, like a bit older
Mm-hmm.
in terms of history. Anyways, it's a sidebar. It's weird. It doesn't really have anything to do with Druids, but it's anybody who's seen it, it's worth checking out because it's just so funny and super weird. It's great.
That's hilarious.
Highly
That's funny.
recommend. Highly
What's
recommend.
it called?
Oh my gosh, if I remember. I think Rome is in the title. I don't know the title because it's in French on my Netflix.
Okay. Is it a French show?
No, no, no. It's
Okay.
it's an like I think it's actually a Japanese show. Okay, yeah, so it's called Ferme Rome Nove.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, worth watching. I really suggest you check it out. It's hilarious. All of you,
That's
everybody
funny.
listening. Okay, anyways, back to Druids. In the time that I was looking into Druids, you and I have been kind of figuring out the flow of this show as we've been doing it. And it's important for us to consider stories in
Yeah.
everything that we do, because that's kind of at the basis of everything that we look into. And so I was looking into some stories about notable Druids, and two stories kind of stuck out to me as I thought they were interesting for a few different reasons. So both of these druids that I'm going to talk about are from the Irish mythological cycles. I feel like
Hmm.
there's more references to druids in the Irish mythological cycles than any other. But
I
also
think
they're
there's
just
more everything in them.
yeah. But I
There's just
also
more
just think
stories.
they're pretty interesting in general. It's pretty, the stories are pretty cool.
Cool. I'm
So
excited.
we're going to get into that now. And I want to make a sincere apology on my pronunciation. I have written everything down phonetically. I tend to go through. I literally like Google all the pronunciation for all of the words I can't figure out, and I listen to them and I write them down phonetically, but sometimes when we get into the actual recording, I get nervous and I like stutter and I like fuck it up. So I'm gonna try my best, and here we go. So, one of the druids that I came across that I thought was interesting is a druid called Moira, and it's kind of like Moira, and it's written like Mogh space Ruith. So you can see by the way that I'm trying to say it versus the way that it's spelled, like for like English language mind, it doesn't totally connect. So, anyways, but it's pronounced Moira or Moira. And this druid is kind of quite, I well, from what I understood, is he's actually one of the most notable druids in in the in Irish mythology.
Okay.
And His name actually translates to the master of the wheel. He's described as a master of magical arts, and he possesses abilities such as shape-shifting, controlling the weather, and he flies through the air on a magical machine that in English is equated to something called the oared wheel. But
What?
yeah, so like in
How does it work?
okay. So
Sorry.
I don't know how it works.
Like, what kind of magical machine? What?
So
Okay.
listen, I couldn't find a pronunciation for what it's called in here. So it's I'm gonna say it and I'm probably gonna fuck it up, but I think it's like ro ram. It's spelled ROTH space RAMACH.
Sure.
So if I was thinking in English, I'd say like Rothramish, but that's probably not right. It's a giant. It's interesting because it's supposed to be a giant flying wheel.
Okay.
So I don't know
A
if this is
flying
where
wheel.
I don't
Okay.
know if this is where I'm suspicious, and I didn't do enough research to know for sure, but I wonder if this is where the concept of the wheel of the year kind of comes from. But anyways, what's
Hmm.
interesting about him is that he's blind in many of the stories, and he flies on this wheel in the air, and because he does that, he's kind of revered as like super speedy, super fast, like nobody can fuck with him basically.
Okay.
You know what I mean? And he's
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
he is both a druid, but also he's like a warrior to a certain degree. And like one of the most famous stories about him um, kind of indicates that. He's also considered like quite a complex character. And when I kind of share this story, you'll probably see why. It's definitely not what we would think of um, traditionally when we think of a druid. So it's very
Okay.
interesting because it's not something most of us know about, but anyway. So one of the most famous stories involving Mohira centers around his daughter. And his daughter's name is, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, please forgive me, Talata? Talata.
Okay.
According to the legend, this girl, Talata, she's sexually assaulted by the king of Terra. And as a result, she becomes pregnant with
Oh,
triplets.
that sucks.
And yeah, super sucks. And it already takes like it's an immediate dip down story, it's like immediately sad.
Yeah.
So she's raped, she has triplets, and as she gives birth to them, she ends up giving birth to them on this hill. And to this day, it's known as the Talita or Calita. I looked at two different variations of her name. Sometimes it sounds like it's pronounced with a T, sometimes it sounds like it's pronounced with a C or a K, like Calita, but it's really
Yeah.
hard for my ears to differentiate between the two. But there's a site called Talita Hill, or the Hill of the Ward. And in the story, she ends up on this hill while she's giving birth. And after she gives birth to the triplets, she dies.
Oh,
And
great.
so yeah. So as she's dying, she asks Macha to light fires for her in remembrance. And these fires that are lit are very symbolic at the time of the year when this was supposed to happen. And the energy of the whole story. It's very symbolic of the death of season. So the
Mm-hmm.
story is related. This story, her story, which I'm kind of summarizing right now, but her story is actually connected to Samhain. So like the
Mm-hmm.
pagan tradition we know as Halloween, or we kind of know
Mm-hmm.
commonly as Halloween, but many of us call it Samhain now. But she's connected. She's like the creator of Samhain because of this story, and then she dies, and she dies on this spot, and they light all of these fires, and the fires are the representation point of like fall going into the winter season. It's also symbolic of the first death of the winter, which we talked about related to solstice. There's so many
Mm-hmm.
symbolisms connected to that. So she's really connected to that whole idea in the Irish mythology, which is really interesting. What becomes more interesting is after that, of course, Mochra is he's pissed. He's mad his daughter's virtue and then she dies. I love our cat.
Understandably so. I would
I,
be
lo-
pissed too.
I love how involved our cats are in this season.
I know.
They are so
I
deeply
know.
involved. You guys can't
Oh,
see it, but
God.
both of our cats have been like deeply, deeply involved today on the camera. My goodness. But anyways,
I know.
he's pissed. So he gets on his flying machine and he this machine enables him to soar through the skies at incredible speeds, and it kind of makes him like nearly invincible in battle. So it's like, imagine like centuries and centuries ago somebody having a jet. It's really interesting because it
Yeah,
kind of makes it
yeah,
seem
I could see that.
he's definitely like otherworldly or like from the future or like something crazy, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So he is pissed and he goes and um he flies over Terra and he destroys the tower in Terra where this king was protecting himself, and he basically lays siege to this area and like kills
Okay.
off everybody and everything. And so
Right.
this is like very interesting because again, we don't necessarily think of a druid as somebody who's going to act on revenge, but that's exactly there's many stories where he's mentioned and he's offering guidance and he's offering different things like this, but the most famous one is actually the one where he like throws the smackdown and like gets revenge on this king who like hurt his daughter.
Well, I think like historically, if druids are going to be so involved with everything politically, and like, yeah, under the Roman Empire they didn't have to pay tax, and like there's a bunch of allowances that they had, but if they're going to be involved in politics, they also have to be involved in war,
Mm-hmm.
especially at that time when there were invasions and so many Celtic tribes and kings and things like that. It's inevitable that they have a large part to play in any war decisions and
And
any battle decisions.
I think it's quite interesting. I don't know if it's like if because his character is often depicted like a complex character. And I think in a lot of the earlier, like I'm thinking now in terms of medieval stories, but a lot of common stories that we know, and not until the most recent times did we really see a return of the idea of the complex character, a character that uses his magic for noble purposes, but also other times uses it for personal gain or revenge in this case. And I think that's very interesting because it shows us that complex characters existed centuries ago and that we weren't
Yes.
necessarily dividing into good and evil at that time. It would
Hmm.
make sense too because we know that division is really something that was birthed out of like the Christian movement, right? So it's very, very
Yeah,
interesting.
because up until that point, I think we all know that humans are complicated and they were written as being complicated.
So if I think I understand this correctly, but Mochila, this particular story is kind of, it's not necessarily a standalone, like his character folds into other stories, but this story is a
Hmm.
standalone. It's not necessarily part of the backbone of the Irish mythological structure, which we know as these cycle series, right? But
Right.
the next druid that I wanted to share
Wait,
with you,
before we go ahead, is there a landmark or like a place in existence that
yeah,
is still around today that marks that? Where is it?
it's called, I can give you the spelling. It's the site of uh Talata. So it's spelled Tlachtga. It's also known as Hill of the Ward. So
Yeah, but like,
when I was researching it, I typed it in and the place came up.
so it's like Ireland, but it is,
I don't know
oh,
exact.
just northeast of or northwest of Dublin.
Yeah,
Yeah, just northwest of Dublin. Okay, cool. I just wanted to get like an idea of where it was in Ireland. Okay,
like
sorry,
geographically
continue.
speaking. Yeah, no, no
Yeah,
problem.
geographically.
So the other druid that I came across that I thought was really interesting was a druid named Bonmal. I'm saying that with a French accent. That's weird. Bonmal. I don't know how to say it. I don't know how to say it
Very
right.
French.
It's spelled Bodhmall. I know I can't help it. I see the word bone and I want to say bon. You know what I mean? Like, but what's interesting about Bon Mal is that they are featured in one of the cycles, and they're featured in
Okay.
the Finian cycle, because.
Ah,
And
okay.
the other interesting part about this druid is it's not a druid; it's a druidess. It's a woman, and we
I like that.
yeah, and we see this. There's a few hints here and there. We see some stories about female druidists. For the most part, we just hear about the male ones, but there were female ones, and I think that's again not necessarily something that we think about very often when we think of the idea of a druid. And it's interesting because it just doubles down to show that like it wasn't based on gender. Like you, if you wanted to be this thing, you could study it and be it, no matter
Yeah,
what you
yeah.
were.
Because, yeah, there were Druidic women, and they were considered pretty equal to men in a lot of different respects, which
Yeah.
was kind of unusual for a community at this time, I guess.
Mm.
And the female Druids, I don't know about what your story is going to say, but they could also take part in war if they wanted to, and they could divorce their husbands if they wanted to.
So
Like,
in
they
the
had a lot of power for the
yeah,
time.
oh for sure. And I think I don't even know if there was like a conversation around what power they should and should not have at that point, which is pretty interesting, you know. So
Hmm.
Bun Mal is kind of she's famous because of the like I said the fourth cycle, the Fenian cycle, with this kind of legendary hero Finn McCool. McCool. It's we say Finn McCool in English, but it's a bit it does kind of sound like that, but it's not actually spelled like that. I think it would be more like Finian McCoy. Anyways,
I
um,
don't know.
it's so hard to figure it out, but I'm trying my best here. But according to some, obviously, like all things, there's different variations. But according to some versions of this legend, Bomel was a druid, or what we would consider like a wise woman, and she was actually the sister to Finian's father, McCool. Cool, not McCool, just Cool. And Cool was a powerful warrior, and he had faced many enemies and a lot of adversity. No, adversity. Adversity. He had a lot of enemies, had gone through a lot of adversity, and he had one major rival named Gull McMorna. So eventually, Cool and Gull McMorna are in a battle, and Cool actually dies. So in this case, Bonmal ends up taking care of Finn or Fien.
Hmm.
And to protect him of the dangers surrounding him, because his father had so many enemies, she decides to take him into the wilderness. So she takes him out in the woods and she raises him and she teaches him the ways of the druids, and she passes on
Hmm.
her wisdom and her knowledge to him. And she plays a crucial role in shaping Fionn's character. And it's kind of her influence on him that leads him to grow up to be very skilled, honorable, and a good warrior, like a kind of what we think of as
Hmm.
a good guy under her
Yeah.
guidance.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the story in itself is more revolving and existing around Finn's character and like all of the different battles that he has, and how he eventually becomes a leader of the Fianna, which is like a
Yeah.
legendary band of warriors in the Irish mythology. So
Hmm.
he ends up becoming the leader of them, but it's all kind of based around the influence and the core values that this druidess teaches him, which I think is really interesting because we've seen bits and pieces of that in other stories as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Cool. Yeah.
just off the top of my head, I'm thinking of what doesn't quite turn the way it does in this story, but we see that idea in with the Lady of the Lake. She takes on that child and raises him in the forest and teaches him
Yeah. It
how
takes
to
on the
be.
orphan,
Or even we
and
see it
yeah.
even in the way that Merlin kind of influences Arthur and is trying to teach him how to
Yeah.
be good. Like it has a theme that's very synonymous with this idea of trying to like coach people into
Instill
morality.
goodness and
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Instill
morality in
goodness
an
into
immoral
someone.
world.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I thought that was really, really interesting as well. So that's just like a little excerpt on her. But like I said, the story mostly revolves around him, but she is quite a notable character in that story because of her influence on him. And ultimately, it's her influence on him that kind of makes him the hero that he ends up being at the end of it.
I like those stories.
Yeah, there's many,
It
there's
is hard, like there's a lot, but it is hard to find these stories of like
it's a bit
specific
tricky
druids.
to
And
like there's I want to say there's like a handful of druid
mhm,
stories for the Irish legends, and they are a bit hard because you know what, druids are often not um a main character. They're usually like a supporting role.
no. And I want to say like they kind of have so many hands in different piles
Hmm.
that it's hard to just find them impacting one story and having one role in a story. It's like there's like little bits and little mentions of them in several different things, and then you kind of have to extract those to get an idea of what they're actually doing,
Yeah,
because
but
it's a
there's
lot.
no doubt in
They're
my
wearing a lot of
mind.
hats.
There's no doubt in my mind, and I'm sure it's probably been said, but I'm not. Oh, you're kind of like the resident Lord of the Rings expert here, but I am quite sure that Gandalf is definitely based
Based on
off
a
of a
druid,
druid,
yeah, I
or
wouldn't be
maybe like the
surprised.
general idea of a druid. Because in reading some of these stories, he kept flashing in my mind, and in the Lord of the Rings, he is always kind of weaving people together because he
Yeah,
understands the destiny and the fates. He understands in like the first Lord of the Rings series, he's kind of like, oh gosh, what's the Hobbit's name? Don't get mad at me. I don't know names.
Bilbo.
Yeah. Bilbo?
Or are
No.
you talking about Frodo?
Frodo. Yeah. In Lord of the Rings, he gets Frodo to take the ring, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
so
Bilbo. He gets
he
Bilbo
picks
to give it
him.
to him.
He picks him because he
Yeah.
sees he's like, so he's innocent and pure. He's like pretty much the only one that could carry the ring, right? And I think it's just
Yeah.
very interesting because it's like those kinds of insights, those mystical things, like reading between the lines, seeing like the other things that are around. It's kind of what Gandalf is always doing through the stories, and it's
Yeah.
in that way it's very similar. And also he fights in a battle at the
Yes.
end. So
Well, he
um
fights in a battle a couple of times, but
yeah, actually, yeah, way more than once.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
all this to show I think he's very maybe inspired by the idea of like the druidic beings from mythology. Yeah, I would think.
I wouldn't be surprised. I think Tolkien was inspired by a lot of myth and story and language that existed,
There's a
and
guy
kind of
on social media that I really need
yeah.
to do a deep dive on because he goes to like, so apparently Tolkien always said that he took inspiration from real places for the places that he
Mm-hmm.
made in the stories. And
Mm-hmm.
this guy actually goes to those places. And there's a bunch of
Oh,
them are in
cool.
France, which I was
Cool.
surprised about. So like a lot of the elfin stuff is
I don't know why you're so surprised, because like
I
England's
don't
right
know.
there.
I don't
It's
know.
right
Yeah.
there.
I'm just like in a perpetual state of unraveling the clusterfuck that is the French English. Like they have so much history, and it's really this
Yeah.
history that's like they hate each other, they kind of like each other, they hate each other, they're kind of the same, but they're not the same, and it's just like wow. It runs so
Yeah,
deeply.
it's a very long entwined history for
I'm just
sure.
always surprised by peeling back yet another layer, I guess, is what it is what it is. Oh yeah, and especially
There's always a deep layer.
because he wrote these during or after the war too. So to double
Well, yeah, he
down,
started writing some of them, some aspects he started writing in the trenches for sure. Like I think he started writing The Adventures of Tom Bombadil when he was in the trenches and
yeah.
kind of started mapping things out already
And
at
I
that
do
point.
kind of get it because I've seen old trenches in the north of France that
Hmm.
are still there.
Hmm.
Um, and it's really bizarre because on one hand, like, okay, I can imagine what the trenches were like back then. And then also France has this weird way of being like very sadly stunning. It's like beautiful, it's like incredibly melancholy, and the light that rolls through, like just the way nature exists here, is it's like honestly one of the number one reasons why I stay in this country is because it's the
Yeah.
landscape is constantly like blowing my mind hole wide open. So I can imagine that like even in a war to have that sense of melancholy of like what the fuck, you know, like it's, and I can imagine like so much poetry and things came out of the two wars that were fought here, and it's just like
Yeah. Yeah.
totally get it. I totally get it after living here. So that's, anyways, I digress. But druids, yeah, Gandalf, woo.
That's funny.
Yeah,
Yes, druids. So I think that's a good little introduction and like
yeah.
cool little stories. And yeah,
Hmm.
if you are interested in finding out more about druids, like you can even just looking at a lot of pagan societies today that follow, the wheel of the year where they follow the 8 holy days of the calendar year, like Imbolc and Yule and Samhain and things like that, will lead you at least a little bit closer to like neo druidry today,
Yeah,
I
and
guess.
neo druidry may not be the same as early druidry, but I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with that because I think the intention of what druidic societies are doing is actually quite good. They're trying to hold on to traditions, they're trying to hold on to the cultures that they still have, and a lot of them are very like environmentally driven, which in this day and age
Yeah.
is really important. So in
Yeah.
general,
Today.
I think even if it's not necessary, there's no way that it could be what it was, but I don't know if that is necessarily needed to not be special and powerful and important, you know. So
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
so
Yeah, today
check
they're
them out,
very heavily involved in raising a- awareness for like pollution and fracking and
which is
unchecked
fantastic.
mining.
Which is
Yeah.
fantastic. Which we need that in the world, right? Plus all of
Yeah.
the celebrations and things that they do within their communities. So yeah, I think we're both pro Druid,
Yeah.
neo and otherwise.
Yeah, I think so. I think that one of their beliefs is like time is cylindrical. So, like, what goes around comes around. So, any actions going against the natural law have grave consequences for future generations.
Mm,
I believe that. I think that
yeah.
that
Now,
is
with
a
that being
good
said,
thought
disclaimer:
process to have.
there are always outliers who go renegade. I know very well. In spirituality, there are always people that go hardcore and go off the deep end. We're not talking about those druids, okay?
No,
That's like
no,
a
we're not.
sect. That's a thing that like no. We're talking about the ones that are just trying to keep the peace, trying to keep the balance, and trying to bring awareness to goodness, which I think is like the general idea
Yeah,
in the neo
yeah,
druidism.
for sure.
Sorry, as soon as we were talking about it, I just remember I read a story about some French druids who were doing some really wonky shit not too long ago. So
Fair enough.
I don't wanna like be pro that.
Fair enough. I think we'll wrap it up there for today. Um,
Yeah.
so thank you so much for joining us. Remember to send us some messages on Instagram, Allegory Story Podcast, and send us an email if you want to. My cat is getting impatient and wants to be fed, so I'm going to go now.
Yeah. Cats are very involved. Did you hear? She just rubbed her face on the mic. My turn, motherfucker. Okay. Anyways, we'll see you guys soon. We'll see you for the next episode of Allegory Story. We're going to keep diving into cool and interesting things about Celtic mythologies.
Bye.
See you soon. Bye.